This week on Africa Update, normalcy gradually returning to the Tigray as rebels begin handing in heavy weapons to Ethiopian government. How does the Ethiopia keep the peace? Also on the program, 100-year coastal floods in Africa now happen every 40 years, says report. Find out why. Plus, a highlight of some of our major stories on the African continent on our Roundup Africa segment. This is Africa Update on Trust TV, reaching you from Abuja, Nigeria's capital. I am Ayuba Ilya. Thanks for joining. The Ethiopian army announced the withdrawal of neighboring regional force from a key city in Tigray, meeting another step in the peace process with Tigray leaders. The withdrawal of Amhara forces and Eritrean troops who supported Ethiopia's army is a key condition of the truce, as is the disarmament of Tigrayan forces who began to hand over their heavy weapons. VOA's Paul Ndiho has more on this.
The Ethiopian army says the Amhara Special Forces, a regional force that had backed the government in the war, had withdrawn from the strategic Tigray city of Shire, meeting another crucial part of the peace deal. During a joint press conference in Addis Ababa, German and French foreign minister cautioned that a reconciliation does not happen overnight. Both called for accountability in the peace process.
And precisely because we in Europe again have to experience what war and the most brutal crimes against humanity mean. The question of accountability is important for us with a view to Ethiopia's future and the peace process, but also to strengthen international law.
The conflict in northern Ethiopia between the federal government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front has claimed untold lives. French Foreign Minister Catherine Corona says peace is now at hand.
Believe me, like Annalena, I am well aware of the courage it took, both for the federal government and the Tigrayan leaders, to choose peace. For it takes courage and even vision to make that choice.
Both ministers were in the country to promise their government support for rebuilding the war-affected areas in Ethiopia. The ministers met with the Deputy Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Demeke Mekonnen, who says the country is committed to the peace process.
This is a new chapter. This is time to settle our internal crisis and focus on our development and transformation.
Earlier, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed greeted the French and German foreign ministers in Addis Ababa. The devastating conflict that erupted in November 2020 has killed untold civilians, displaced more than 2 million, and left millions in more need of humanitarian aid. Following the peace agreement signing in Pretoria, South Africa, there has been a limited resumption of deliveries to Tigray, which is facing dire shortages of food, fuel, cash, and medicines. Also being restored to Tigray, a region of 6 million people, are essential services such as communications, banking, and electricity, which was cut off during the fighting.
All right, now before we begin the conversation, here is a quick look at some of the facts about the Tigray conflict. Now, the TPLF authoritarian rule provoked a popular uprising that ultimately forced Abiy's predecessor, Hailemariam Desalegn, to resign. Now, in 2018, Abiy was appointed by the ruling class to quell tensions and bring change without upsetting the old political order. But the rearrangement of the ruling coalition that the TPLF had founded, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Front, or EPRDF, which was composed of 4 parties, into a single new prosperity party, ignoring the TPLF in the process, led to political tension in the region. The Tigrayans defied Abiy by going ahead with regional parliamentary elections that he had delayed due to the coronavirus pandemic. Abiy called the vote illegal and lawmakers cut funding to the TPLF leadership. On November 4th, after accusing the TPLF of attacking a federal army base outside Tigray's regional capital, Mekele, and attempting to steal its weapons, Abiy ordered a military assault against the group, and this resulted in a 2-year-long war. In November 2022, a negotiation committee led by delegates of the African Union reached a peace deal between both sides, agreeing to halt their 2-year conflict, which led to at least 600,000 deaths and famine. Now, under the peace deal, disarmament for the northern region should take place concurrently with the withdrawal of foreign forces that are not part of the Ethiopian National Army. Now, we'll take a look at this in details shortly after this breather. All right, now joining me for more perspectives on this is Philip Pandey, who joins me from Kenya. He is an economist and also a governance expert to talk about this. Thank you so much for your time, Philip, and for joining us on Africa Update. There's been an announcement by the government that neighboring troops are withdrawing from that region, the Tigray region. However, reports are also suggesting that there's still a heavy presence of troops in that region. So how can this peace deal be sustained when there is a seeming lack of trust in this instance?
Rightly put, Ayub, is that the guns have been silenced, ideally from the signing of the now famous Pretoria peace pact between the warring factions of Ethiopia, that's the Tigray Liberation Front and the Ethiopian government. But the drums of war are yet to be fully silenced. We could see and obtain traces of the presence of the military, and in particular, the neighboring country of Eritrea still suspected to have troops in the neighboring border towns of the Tigray and the northern Ethiopia. It would be important that as the region and as African Union and as parties in the conflict, then we bring all cards on the table, particularly give full authority, full safety, and the assurance to the warring parts of Ethiopia that indeed, once the peace accord has been signed, then we do not need to see the presence of heavy military operations. We don't need to see, at worst, the presence of the neighboring countries' uniform on the border across Ethiopia. So it's fundamental that parties in the peace accord remain faithful to the peace deal, and we thank former President Olusegun Obasanjo, former President Uhuru Kenyatta, for making it possible that peace and restoration and rehabilitation is seen in Tigray. So what I want to call upon, especially the government of Ethiopia, that at this particular time, it's important that we reassure, especially the inhabitants of the northern Ethiopia region, that their safety is within the custody of government, their peace and progress can be guaranteed without any further ado.
All right. Now, what should be the priorities of the Ethiopian government now, especially in a post-war situation such as this? There's a whole lot going on in that region, really. So what should the government prioritize?
At the center of everything is humanity. and restoring the socio-economic fabrics of the Tigray area. But before that is done, allow me to emphasize the need to have people respect the names that we call each other. For example, you know that the Parliament of Ethiopia made it a legal entity. That is particularly referring to the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, that is now initially recognized as a terrorist group or a peace-threatening entity. It is important that that tag of the name of the TPLF is removed by the parliament so that the Ethiopian government can finally recognize those inhabitants of Ethiopia, the Tigray area, and those inhabitants that perhaps participated more in the conflict to be recognized as citizens of Ethiopia, because that's the fact, so that the regional government of Tigray is respected as such, and that there is nobody calling each other different tags that would, again, precipitate conflict or have underlying issues. Now, when I mentioned that humanity is at the core, by the 6th month of this conflict, it was estimated that at least 91% of persons living within the Tigray area needed humanitarian support and emergency services. To put it rightly, is that at the end of the conflict, then we expect that 100% then of the 7.3 million inhabitants of the Tigray area then needed emergency and relief support. You will also remember, Ayub, that within that very region, then about 2.3 million people were displaced, another 2 million lost livelihoods, and massive infrastructure was destructed. Hospitals, schools, roads, such infrastructure were not spared, water, utilities. So it's important that we begin providing for the people at the north, and perhaps also restoring communication. You realize that the Ethio Telecom Communications Company, which is the largest, perhaps up to this moment, even without with the entrance of Safaricom in that region, estimated that the damages in their telco infrastructure and the loss of business was worth $74 million US, and they've used about $7 million US to restore infrastructure and to begin communicating in the Tigray region. So it's fundamental that as we restore humanity, there is also need to interconnect and reintegrate that region with the rest of the bloc in Ethiopia, the rest of the Horn of Africa, and the rest of the world. And so communication becomes a fundamental part of that ecosystem.
Okay.
There is also a need.
You know, we are looking at a situation where we have a lot of people who have lost their livelihoods, people who have lost their properties, who have been displaced, really. So aside the humanitarian support and assistance, how can we get this large number of people back on their feet doing things?
We go back to where we started, that we begin by assuring people that when they come back to their community to reintegrate, then they will be safe, they will be home, their property will be given back to them, and land titles that may have shifted ownership as it were in situations of conflict then could be reverted back to the regional title owners, so that people with capacity to build their homes, people with the bit of feelings that they could still be threatened from their communities, they could experience marginalization or almost torture or displacement. Let us guarantee as a government of Ethiopia that people settling back and with capacity to settle in Ethiopia in the Tigray region could basically have their home back. For those who lost title of land due to invasion of militia or illicit terror groups, then could be restored back and get their titles and own or re-own their homes once again. I was at the point when I was mentioning that we know for a fact that Ethiopian Parliament passed about a $1.8 billion US budget for military spending. If we assure, and if we have to reassure the people of Tigray that indeed conflict is over, the war is over, then let us revert that budget and use it in more meaningful spending, especially in socio-economic reconstruction.
Talk about political reintegration now in terms of the decisions that the Prime Minister took before this war. Are we likely to see him reverse some of those decisions?
There has been quite a huge thought that perhaps one of the reasons why this conflict was more elevated is perhaps the need or the struggle for the region to be recognized as an independent region. I will take you back that to the 1998 to 2000 conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia, especially on the border issue. And I think one of the reasons why this region perhaps experienced a lot of invasion from the neighboring country is that during that previous conflict, then there was a lot of influence by the Tigray region, especially on matters of the border concerns. It is important that as we come to an end of such a prolonged fight that led to the loss of estimated 600,000 people, then political intonations, political connotations of the people at the north, especially, who feel marginalized in that aspect. It is important that the regional government participates meaningfully in issues that are discussed and passed at Addis, with more emphasis to resource allocation, more emphasis to recognition of the potential of the area, recognizing that it's just about 10% of the Ethiopian population. Of course, reintegrating the leaders of the region into the main framework of governance in Ethiopia, so that we do not find a lot of splinter group. You will agree with me, Ayub, that one of the reasons why people fight is for the very fact that they feel excluded, disrespected politically, socially, religiously, or economically. So it's not just all about political reintegration. It's about economic enablers. It's about religious space. It's about cultural participation.
All right, Philip Pandey, thank you so much.
Once again, thank you very much for having me. It's been a good conversation, speaking to you about matters that really affect our region, the Horn of Africa, the East Africa region, and for the very fact that you know that Ethiopia is one of the fastest growing economies in Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa. And as Kenya, as the region, we wholly depend on tranquility within the region, and every other nation is important, every other community is important, and all of us must pull together if the aspirations of Africa, if the aspirations within the AU Charter have to be realized, and if the Vision 2063 must be achieved.
All right.
Once again, I appreciate you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. All right. You're watching the Africa Update on Trust Television. Coming up shortly, we'll take a look at the 100-year coastal floods in Africa, now happening every 40 years. Join us again. That's great. Welcome back from that break. Now, a new report by the Africa Center for Strategic Studies says once in 100 years, floods will become more common in coastal communities due to rising sea levels caused by climate change. A stretch of West Africa's coast is set to become the world's largest megalopolis and an economic powerhouse. Academics worry rising sea levels will stymie growth and impact the continent and the world. VOA's Henry Wilkins reports from Gamvi, Benin.
Once-a-century floods are projected to start happening once every 40 years thanks to rising sea levels caused by climate change, according to the new report from the Africa Centre for Strategic Studies, a US Department of Defense-funded think tank. Experts say the disruption to Africa's coastal and port cities will have a devastating impact on inland economic growth. On the outskirts of Benin's economic capital, Cotonou, dwellings in the town of Gamvi are built on stilts in a coastal lagoon. It's sometimes referred to as the Venice of Africa. Local government officials in the commune of Soava, where Gamvi is located, say flooding has gotten worse in recent decades.
Dans la commune de Soava ici, il y a deux activités principales.
There are two primary economic activities here in the commune of Soava, agriculture and fishing. So when the water rises, the crops are destroyed. Also, the freshwater fish disappear. As a result, economic life becomes difficult.
The effects on the community have been devastating. Residents say their houses have been rendered uninhabitable and
many of our belongings were destroyed. Because of the flooding, the house you see was destroyed last year, and I had to rebuild it on another piece of land to prevent the water from coming in again.
He says he knows parents whose children drowned in the flooding. Alexandra Bodo, another Gamvi resident, says his livestock living in this pen were lost to the flood and the water filled his house to this level.
We lose our houses and we have no money to rebuild them, so the whole family sleeps in a boat.
Communities along the coast around estuaries and coastal lagoons like Gamvi will be the first to bear the brunt of the impacts. Flooding and coastal erosion will also affect Africa's ports. Not enough is being done, according to economists.
One of the things that I find shocking is how little finance is going to support these cities overall in terms of building infrastructure and services. But particularly with climate, it's extremely important that we not only adapt, but with the rising sea levels, that mitigation is taken into account as well.
Experts say the stretch of West Africa's coastline from Abidjan to Lagos is on track to become the world's largest megalopolis and could be home to 500 million people by the end of this century.
That's probably 50% of Africa's, or more than 50% of Africa's total GDP in that strip. So if it develops well, it could really anchor the continent, it could anchor the globe in terms of heading into this sustainable development.
Aside from Gamvi, Lagos and Ghana's capital of Accra experienced major floods in 2022.
Time now for us to take a look at Roundup Africa as presented by Chamaka Nwafo.
Malawi's president fired the director of public prosecution, Stephen Kayuni, for allegedly abusing his office to avenge what he saw as a personal slight. Malawian President Lazarus Chakwera announced the dismissal during a televised national address on Wednesday. Chakwera was reacting to the findings of a commission of inquiry he established last month to investigate the circumstances that led to the arrest of the country's anti-corruption chief, Martha Chizuma. The commission found that Chizuma was arrested a few days after Kayuni complained to police that he felt criminally injured by statements Chizuma made in January 2022. Chizuma was arrested on December 6th but detained for only a few hours. Following calls from other officials, ordinary Malawians, and the British and US embassies for her release. Cameroon's government deployed at least 100 troops on Wednesday to Guyama, a village on the border with Nigeria, after clashes between Cameroonian separatists and Nigerian herders left at least 12 people dead. Cameroonian officials say the fighting broke out 6 days ago after herders who crossed the border in search of food for their cattle refused to pay taxes the rebels demanded. Abdullahi Aliu, the highest-ranking government official in Menkum, the administrative unit in charge of Guyama, said the rebels killed 2 herders immediately upon the refusal to pay. The surviving herders, who are ethnic Fulani from Taraba and Benue states, returned home and organized a counterattack. Ali said the herders came back in huge numbers, attacked separatist camps and killed at least 4 fighters, 6 civilians, including the traditional ruler of Munkem village and his son, were also killed in the clashes. Authorities say at least 20 civilians were injured, scores of cattle were killed and homes were torched. This is not the first time Cameroon's Anglophone separatists have attacked Nigerians along the border. The separatists have been fighting since 2017 to carve out an English-speaking state from French-speaking majority Cameroon. The UN says the conflict has left more than 3,500 people dead and 750,000 displaced. The United Nations on Wednesday said peacekeepers discovered mass graves in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo following a series of attacks blamed on a local militia. UN Deputy Spokesman Farhan Haq told reporters one grave in the village of Yamamba contained 42 bodies, including 6 children. 7 bodies were found in a grave in the village of Mbogi. The graves are located in Ituri province, where Haq said there has been a significant deterioration of the security situation in Dujugu and Mahagi territories. Haq says since December, the UN peacekeeping mission has said at least 195 civilians have been killed and 84 people abducted in incidents linked to 2 armed groups, Codeco and Zaire. The United Nations says more than 1.5 million people have been displaced in Ituri, and the attacks have hampered humanitarian efforts. And that's it on Roundup Africa.
And that's a wrap on Africa Update for this week. Join us next week for another edition of the program. I am Ayuba Ilya. Watch more via all our social media platforms and also on our YouTube channel. Bye for now.